Hello and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host Rob. In today's video, I'm going to be continuing with my campaign review of my Whitespire campaign. I wanted to do the Great Charisma Challenge multi-class video, but I kind of wanted to give my friends a chance to maybe we could all get together and each one could present their own build and the ideas behind it. And I don't know if that's going to happen. Just the logistics of everybody trying to get together right now are crazy. We got people on night shift and day shift, and people are all over the place. And I don't want to delay the video forever, so I want to give it a couple more days, see if I can try to get something scheduled. But I might just have to, present each one of their builds all by myself, which is fine too, right? But it would have been nice to kind of have them talk about the thought process and really go into some depth about why they made the choices they did, right? But whatever, I still didn't want to, just not do anything, so I figured I'll continue with the Whitespire series. So, one of the things I wanted to talk about really quickly for this campaign was some of the player, to kind of give people an idea of more of the player characters before we jump into things. So, I kind of mentioned this last time, but first up we have Crag. He's a Dragonborn barbarian. And as I mentioned, all the Dragonborn in my world were actually created by this guy named Gull the Half-God. And Gull was a name that I sort of stole from Talus by Monty Cook, right? But he basically created my Dragonborn as to be his foot soldiers and stuff. But after he disappears, trying to enter into the citadel of this old former big bad called the Dread One, he just kind of disappears, and the Dragonborn all kind of scatter and go their own ways, and now they're kind of free of his control, right? So Crag is rather poor. He's a dock worker at the beginning, and he lives with this old human guy named Silas, and Silas gave him a place to live, and he kind of works and makes money so that Silas can pay the bills, kind of thing, right? And Silas is kind of I guess his dependent in a way, but also kind of the person providing him with a place to live, right? And Crag was originally from this one mountain range in my game called Tiamat's Teeth, and his people lived there. And there was some sort of mystery there too he knew about. There was this city that none of them were allowed to enter except for the clan chiefs and some of the wise women or wise men, and basically the village elders and clan chiefs, right? And he was actually driven out. His father had abandoned the ways of their old ways and had turned to the worship of Tiamat, and so he'd actually challenged his father, but was defeated by him. And everybody thought that he'd actually died, and maybe he actually did. But either way, he challenges his father, loses, is executed, and then hears the voice of Bahamut speaking to him and telling him, you're going to be my champion, and I'm going to through you I will accomplish many great things, right? And nobody even knows that Bahamut's even around anymore. As I mentioned in the last video, Bahamut's been sealed away in this kind of extraplanar prison by Tiamat and some of her followers. And then also this other god named the K, who was part of that whole plot as well. The K, his entire religion, the K is the keeper of secrets, and his entire religion is devoted to just destroying knowledge and eliminating it from the world, even from themselves in many cases. And so over the generations of the last several thousand years since Bahamut was imprisoned, they've just systematically erased most memories of Bahamut. And Dawnblast, the Justice Maker, who at one point was a lieutenant of Bahamut, he's kind of stepped up and become the new lawful good god of the Pantheon. And he's kind of one of the weaker gods of the nine, but he's very important to Whitespire because his followers built the city along with the dwarves, right? So that's all going to be relevant because he's very important to the city. And in fact, by tradition, the high priest of Dawnblast is permanently given the position of one of the crown justices, who are this legislative group of justices and judges who basically make a bunch of the decisions that the king doesn't want to make, essentially, right? And in this particular timeline, they're particularly important because the king has dementia and he isn't making any decisions anymore. But he also hasn't died, so there's nobody to inherit the throne yet. And the king's in his 80s. He's been married 3 different times. He keeps naming different children to the succession. But the latest one was the daughter of his third wife, and she is like 19. She's very attractive, she's very popular, but she's also she's very kindly and good-hearted, but a little dim-witted. And some of her older brothers and sisters, who some of them are in their 50s, right, or almost 60 even, and some of them just don't want her to take the throne, right? So there's a lot of like infighting the noble class, and I just wanted to set a stage for a city that's really kind of paralyzed because the king's out of commission essentially, but not dead, so you can't really replace him. And then also there's a bunch of infighting among the nobles, there's infighting amongst the justices, there's a lot of like dissension in basically all the ranks of power, right? And this kind of sets a stage for a place where the player characters can actually make important decisions because nobody else is, right? Anyways, as I said, I always steal inspiration from different sources, and I'll be talking about a bunch of those as we go through this video. But anyway, so that's kind of Crag and his story. Next, we have the other Dragonborn character in this party, and her name was Shadaza, and she was a paladin. And in my game, a lot of the like subclasses are all kind of chosen when you hit those levels, right? So she was actually staying at the Temple of Dawnblast. She was kind of a worshiper of Dawnblast, but really, it's kind of like the Norse or the Greek pantheons, right? Like you might worship Zeus, but you believed in all the Greek gods, right? If you worship Odin, you also believe in Thor and Loki and all the others. You might feel more allegiance to Odin, but you believe in all of them, right? And it's the same thing with the Nine, So just because you worship Dawnblast, you still believe in Tiamat, you still believe in Nun, the Beast Lord, and, Shara, the Sun Goddess, etc., right? So she's at the Temple of Dawnblast and is thinking of taking her oaths to him and probably being like oath of devotion or something along those lines, right? But things don't really work out that way, and she ends up becoming more of the Green Knight style, becomes an Oath of the Ancients paladin, and swears allegiance to a nun, but we'll get into that in a moment. So that's kind of her story. At one point, she'd actually, in her backstory, she'd actually been petrified by like a basilisk or something, and had just sat in the front lawn of this other temple for 5 years until finally somebody was like, oh hey, that's actually not a statue. And they actually like end up getting her cured, and she becomes back, well, not human but dragonborn again, right? And I just thought that was kind of a funny backstory, so I was like, yeah, what the heck, right? Next we had Alatar, and he is a Stormborn sorcerer. He doesn't know who his parents are. He just knows that he was found by a bunch of forest gnomes who raised him, and so he's very fond of gnomes, even though he himself is a half-elf. And Elatar was a really fun character. I really loved all the player characters in this campaign, to be honest. There was a lot of fun role play, and Elatar had this really naive and sweet personality, and he was just a complete idiot, which is always just delightful for somebody who plays him well. And he was just a really fun character. And he's brand new to Whitespire. In the first game session, he like shows up and has no idea what he's doing, right? He's never been to the city at all. The biggest place he's ever seen is like 500 people, and Whitespire has like 500,000. It's the biggest city in my entire game world, right? Next, we have Cole the Bard, and Cole is a traveling merchant and a collector of tales. So he's less the singing, performing with instruments bard, although he can do those kind of things too. But mostly he's like a narrator, and he likes to tell these grand epic tales, and people in the inn would like listen to him as he recites these tales of heroes and legends of lore kind of thing, right? And that was kind of his shtick. And he liked to go to new places and find like trivia or bits of history that he would work into his stories and stuff, right? And, then like I said, on the side, he's also a traveling merchant. And his grand plan was to build a series of like merchant houses and do all this trade throughout all these different cities, right? So he doesn't necessarily live in Whitespire originally, but he's been to Whitespire many times because Whitespire is this huge, massive city and there's tons of trade, right? And then lastly, we have Magnus. And Magnus is a wizard. Troy was planning on becoming a necromancer, but technically at level 1 he's not a necromancer yet. He's a member of the Inverted Pyramid, which is a name I stole from Tallis as well, but Monty Cook. And the Inverted Pyramid is like the biggest I just call it an arcane guild because it's like the wizards, sorcerers, bards, and warlocks are all kind of together there, right? And then I have a bunch of different schools of magic within that. So there's like, and a lot of the NPCs who run the schools aren't necessarily very high level. I mentioned this in the last video, but I had only one level 20 NPC in my entire game world. I had some others who were like 17, 18, 19, but I wanted them to be very rare. And the leader of the inverted pyramid herself is like 15th level, or I think she was 16th level later on, but she was 15th level to start with. Many of the people who ran the different schools, like there was a dwarf who was the evocation school leader, and he was like 9th level, right? Some of the others were like 7th, 8th, 9th level. The highest ones were usually 12 or 13. And again, they kind of set the stage for a place where the player characters could get to a decent level and actually make an impact in the world, right? It's hard for them to do that when you got guys like Elminster or Mordenkainen running around doing everything, right? I didn't really want that necessarily. I wanted a place where the players, even by like 6th or 7th level, would have already distinguished themselves and become major players in the events, right? So Magnus is lawful evil, and his grand plan was to one day take over the world, essentially. So that will be relevant as we get later into the campaign, believe me. But anyways, so for the first mission, to start things out, I stole basically a scenario from a book, not from Dungeons & Dragons, but from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay called Wrestle Dead. And this particular mission is A Rough Night at the Three Feathers. Now, I made a bunch of changes to this. The inn location in the adventure is actually in some like remote place, and the players are just on the road. They get caught in this huge storm, and this is the only inn in sight, right? But of course, I wanted this to take place inside of Whitespire, and I had big ideas on how to fit this into my campaign. So I really restructured a lot of stuff. And the players themselves, they end up getting like roped into like serving this one noble and having to represent her in some sort of challenge. I didn't want any of that stuff. I had my own ideas of where to go from here, so I made a bunch of changes. Some of the NPCs that die in the adventure, I decided to have them live. Some of the ones that live, I decided to have them die. I just, changed a lot of stuff. But the reason I chose this particular mission is because it's actually just a really, really fun adventure. It has a lot of role play, and I really like doing a lot of role play early so players can start trying to find a voice for that character and, kind of feel their way into like, hey, what am I kind of like? What is this character's personality going to be, right? And it was just one that has a bunch of intersecting plot lines and a lot of like just really weird and fun and crazy events. And the players ended up playing into that, and things got even weirder and more crazy and more fun. So just to hit some of the main summaries, I don't want to spend too much time in this adventure because this was literally from level 1 to level 2 is what they were playing here, right? So I decided, I knew that there was going to be this wedding, and this one woman by the name of Elena of Eastwich, she was from the city of Eastwich, was going to be marrying into one of the most prominent noble families in Whitespire. And this is a noble family that's kind of allied with the king's family, but also kind of like friendly rivals, right? And Elaine herself is renowned for her incredible beauty and also her singing voice, and she's marrying into this other noble family, and it's going to be like a big alliance. And so there's some people that are quite excited, but there's also a lot of people that are worried. But there's also a lot of like nobles and stuff from other cities, especially Eastwich, that are all in town for the wedding. So the players are hired for this really easy mission, essentially, where they just have to protect this one noble couple that are in town for the wedding. And they just want to see Whitespire and see the sights, so they are hired to protect them as they go to the festival grounds. Because the festival grounds, while very fun, it's also full of carnies and thieves and pickpockets and all sorts of, reprehensible sorts that the nobles are a little worried about, right? It kind of has a bad reputation sometimes. So the player characters just escort them. They go have fun at the festival. I was hoping the players might interact with some of the, attractions a bit more. But my players tend to be very mission focused. And if their job was to protect this couple, then they weren't going to do anything that was going to jeopardize that. So they were just laser focused on like making sure nothing happens to them, right? But there ended up being a huge storm in the middle of the afternoon. The couple retired to the inn where they were staying at. And I'd mentioned to the players specifically that they had, well, the girl had this black coach with like golden letters on the side, writing on the side, right? Because that ends up being irrelevant. So anyways, they stop at the end, and the players are just kind of like going to go their own way. And a couple are like, hey, we hired you guys to protect us for the day, and the day's not over yet. So they're like, okay, whatever. I guess we'll get rooms at the end too, right? And like I said, it's just an absolute downpour. So they end up meeting a bunch of the NPCs at the end, and this is where things start to get really fun. So among some of the more interesting NPCs, there's like 6 different plot lines that are all like kind of going on and intersecting each other, right? And there's one guy named Bruno, and he's just arm wrestling people at the end. So the barbarian decides that he's going to challenge Bruno to an arm wrestle, right? But unfortunately, Crag, setting the stage for his entire career to come, rolls like a 2 or a 3 or something and loses to Bruno. But then Jaden remembers that, hey, if I rage, I have advantage on this kind of stuff. So he challenges Bruno to a rematch, and this time he decides to rage when they arm wrestle, and he immediately proceeds to roll like a 1 and a 2 or a 2 and a 3 or some other disastrous roll, and once again loses to Bruno. So Bruno still reigns as champion of the inn. They made a bunch of the other people. Among the more interesting people, there's these 3 priests of the local death god, right? And not Neril. This is like a more local god, and he's not really like the god of death. His priests are more like funeticians. I don't know what they're called. They take care of like funerals and bodies and stuff like that, right? And they preserve them or bury them or whatever else, right? And it's a fairly minor god. It's kind of one of the servants of Neril, to be honest. But it turns out the 3 priests aren't actually priests. They're actually like smugglers and bounty hunters that have been hired from the Empire of Tarsus, which is like the enemy empire to the south. And they have been sent to try to recover this one escaped prisoner. Not really a prisoner. They wanted to capture him, but he escaped. So he's never technically been a prisoner. But they capture him in Whitespire, and they knock him out, they drug the guy, and they put him in this coffin, and they want to try to like sneak him back out. But then the storm hits, and the ship captain they've booked passage with, he's like, I'm not a lunatic. There's no way we're sailing in this weather. Like, you're stuck here for the night. So they convince the innkeeper that they need to be able to bring the coffin to the room with them as part of their, custom. It's one of their own brethren who's passed away, and they want to make sure that all the rites are done properly, and they don't want to leave the coffin out of their sight or put it in the stables or anything like that. That just wouldn't be proper. So the players hear them arguing with the innkeeper, but eventually they just bribe the guy, and he agrees, and they take the coffin upstairs, which of course has the unconscious person in it, right? So there's also like a smuggling thing that happens, and like a blackmailing thing. There's a bunch of other stuff that goes on, and the players have a chance to interact with a bunch of this stuff. But the wizard, Magnus, he decides, I'm just going to go to my room, and I'm going to read for the night, because screw these guys, right? So he retires to his room. Anyways, as things happen, the one guy who's being blackmailed decides he's had enough, and he literally kills his blackmailer. And the players end up finding his body in the room at some point, because one of the servants screams and like makes a scene, and this guy's just taken off. The players didn't stop him or anything, so he's just gone, right? And now there's a dead body in the room, and the innkeeper's all freaking out and doesn't know what to do with it. So the wizard's like, well, I mean, we can't really do anything anyways in this weather. The city watch will come. We can tell them in the morning. So he just decides, hey, let's just give the body to the death priests. Well, we got 3 priests staying in the other room. They're priests of the death god. They handle this kind of stuff all the time. So they agree to take the body in their room for like, I think it was 25 silver or whatever they asked for. So now they have an actual dead body in addition to their, unconscious bounty that they've been hired to bring back to Tarsus. So at some point, this group comes in. There's like this one nobleman, and they're just drenched, and he's got like these 4 big bodyguard types with him, a couple half-orcs and a couple like big human guys. And he's like upset because he recognizes a certain carriage parked at the inn, because it happens to belong to his fiancée. Yes, of course, it turns out that the noble couple that they've been hired to protect, she's technically engaged to somebody else. So he decides that he's going to take it upon himself to like find her and drag her out and probably whip her publicly and, kill the guy that she's sleeping with. The player characters are like, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. So the two Dragonborn, the Barbarian and the Paladin, end up confronting these guys upstairs in the hallway. And the Barbarian decides to let loose with his breath weapon because they are outnumbered. And the player characters are only level 1, so this could be a tough fight. So the two of them actually end up unleashing their breath weapons on these guys and kill all 4 of them. So now we've got like 4 more dead bodies. So once again, the wizard's like, well, more work for the death priest. So they pay them all the 25 silver per body. And now these guys have like 1 actual person in the coffin who's not dead, and 5 actual corpses just like stacked up in the closet at this point, right? This one woman shows up. She's actually a bounty hunter, and she ends up arm wrestling Bruno. She also loses to Bruno, but is pretty back and forth for a little bit. She made some pretty good dice rolls, it turns out, but Bruno beats her, and the two of them end up having this conversation. They end up getting drunk, and then they retire to Bruno's room. So other players are like, oh, good for Bruno, I guess. But turns out this woman's actually been hunting the smugglers because she realizes what's up, and she's trying to find out whatever's going on there. She doesn't know about the person in the coffin, though. She just knows that there's these 3 smugglers who are apparently hunting one of her friends, and she's trying to save her friend. She doesn't know they've already captured him. So at some point, after Bruno's long asleep, she ends up like sneaking out and murdering the 3 death priests, who of course are really smugglers and bounty hunters anyway, so they're not really priests, But now we just have even more dead bodies in the room. A bunch of other things happen as well. The players interact with everything, but I'm already spending too long. This is like literally the first mission, But anyways, in the morning, the storm finally breaks. The innkeeper manages to make contact with City Watch, who show up and find like nearly 10 bodies in this one room, just like all stacked up. But they also find 1 living person who's, in a coffin. And he ends up telling them that he's actually the scribe to the ambassador to Tarsus. But the ambassador was arrested, and he's managed to find out that there's actually an army coming, and the city's going to be attacked. So he convinces the party to take him to, the authorities, and he's able to pass on the word, hey, we're about to be invaded by this giant army. This sets the stage for the next game, which is basically the siege, and this basically takes us to level 5. So technically tier 1 is levels 1 to 4 essentially, but we're just going to go to level 5 because that wraps up this storyline neatly. So there's a lot of things going on in this storyline, right, to come. There's a bunch of new taxes that end up getting passed, and in particular these taxes punish the dwarves, who's, like I said, the dwarves are some of the actual founders of Whitespire, and by tradition, 1 member of the dwarf king's royal family always resides in Whitespire. And sometimes it's a distant cousin or whatever, but in this case, it's actually his 3rd son, right? So he's got 3 sons. This one's 3rd in line to inherit. Probably never going to happen, but he's still literally one of the sons of the dwarf king, right? So he ends up going missing, it turns out, because he's been kidnapped. The players don't know that yet, but that's going to be relevant very quickly, so I might as well just throw that out there. Another another group that's being targeted by these new taxes is the Arcane Guild, the Inverted Pyramid. And it's funny because the Inverted Pyramid, like I said, is like the biggest mage guild in the entire world, and they are one of the big pillars of Whitespire, and one of the reasons why really nobody wants to mess with them, because they've got this massive guild. And even though most of them are like level 2 and 3 and whatnot, still there's a ton of them, including some high level ones, right? So these new taxes are kind of sent to punish the dwarves and to punish the wizards, and or the arcane casters in general, right? And just to be funny, I decided to make this one, the leader of the evocation skill is a dwarven wizard. So he's doubly taxed, and he's quite incensed. He gives this big impassioned speech about how, if they're going to turn their backs on us right now when they need us most, then I'm not going to raise a finger to help them. And, they can come begging to me if they want me to save this city. And then, roll back these taxes, and then we can talk, right? And personally, I thought this speech was ridiculous. But all the player characters were like, yeah, that's right, So like, okay, good job, guys. So I thought it was kind of funny. But anyway, so now they basically neutralized the dwarves, and then the dwarf king's son ends up being kidnapped. So now the dwarves are actually quite angry with the city, and the justices are kind of confused. So that'll be relevant in a second here. But anyways, this one city constable by the name of Muncie, he ends up hiring the player characters to do a job for him, because he's worried about things like supplies and stuff. And obviously they've managed to bring a bunch of people inside the city walls, and they've brought in a bunch of food and stuff, but he's worried that, they're literally going to be besieged, and that they're going to have a hard time bringing in food and stuff. And, the harbor's all been barricaded by this blockade of enemy ships and stuff. And so he wants the player characters to try to broker a deal with this one like thieves guild that are mostly all smugglers and whatnot. And his idea is, we're going to give the thieves guild amnesty, but they're going to have to split like food and essential provisions with the city. And he knows that there's no way that they're ever going to trust him to make this deal, so he decides, you know what, the players have kind of made a bit of a stir already by bringing news of the siege and stuff, and it does seem like they have the city's best interests at heart. So he ends up hiring them to make this deal with him for the smugglers, right? But one of his constables, a man by the name of Constable Orn, one of his subordinates, is quite infuriated by this. And Orn is like a real letter of the law by the book type of guy. And the fact that we are now going to be working with smugglers and thieves, like, we're the city watch, we don't do that. He wants to string all these people up from the gallows and the player characters along with them, But it is his superior officer calling the shots here. And Muncie, on the other hand, is a big picture guy. He's just like, no, look, we need provisions for the city. These people are pretty good at sneaking stuff into the city and not getting caught. Maybe they can do that for us, So the player characters end up working out a deal with them. And sure enough, the thieves, of course, want help as well. They're having some problems with a different group that's kind of moving in on their territory. And this group turns out to be some were-rats, which fortunately the players have a couple silver weapons at this point, because they're able to get some money together, and they figure like, oh yeah, it sounds like these guys are were-rats, we might need this. So they end up wiping out the were-rats. The Thieves Guild's happy with that, so they agree to the terms. The City Watch is like, yeah, okay, whatever, these were the terms we wanted. Along the line, the players meet this guy named Vance, who I actually named after Jack Vance, creator of the Dying Earth books. And Vance and his buddy Johan, Vance is like this big Goliath guy from the north, from like the northern mountain range. But he's like a former smuggler as well. So he was like retired, but Muncie still knew who he was, but he could never really prove anything, so the guy had never gone to prison or anything. But he was kind of like the contact point that he gives them, and the players like meet him, right? He also discovered this awesome game called the Demon Wheel. And the Demon Wheel is literally this like big Wheel of Fortune type thing. And it's just got all these different things written on it, right? And they've all just been like painted on. And the idea is you spin the wheel, whatever it lands on, the two contestants have to run out into the street. You're not allowed to purchase the items, but you somehow have to acquire these items and bring them back. And then it goes for several rounds, and each time you have to be like pounding back drinks between all the different rounds. And that just makes it even more difficult, of course. And the first one to collect the 3 objects that you end up spinning for wins, and there you go. But the Demon Wheel itself is just this horrid contraption in like this giant wheelbarrow, and they just like pour all these different types of alcohol in. It's just this ghastly mess. And it ended up being a really fun game though. So Crag the Barbarian agrees to challenge Vance, and for probably the only time in Crag's career, he actually manages to win some kind of skill challenge. Turns out that he's actually really good at getting drunk, or at drinking. He holds his drink well, is what I meant to say. And so Vance agrees to help. The players also meet like the proprietor of the inn, and what turns out to be her husband. I took this pair of NPCs from the Blight, and her husband Crispin. Crispin is kind of like this like halfling hero, because he went and saved this one like baker's daughter like several years ago. But unfortunately, whatever he went through, nobody really knows what. The baker's daughter was gone for several weeks, and Crispin somehow managed to rescue her. But when he came back, his mind's just never really been the same. He's just kind of, mentally incapacitated for the most part. He just sits there in the inn and plays cards with Vance and his buddies, and they just mostly let him win most of the time. And they kind of like have their own side game, so whoever has the actual best hand gets some of the pot. But they just always let Crispin win, mostly because they all feel sorry for him, and they're all like really grateful for what he did, but nobody really knows how to heal him or cure him, and they've tried different magical means, but nothing's worked, right? I mention this because it'll become relevant later, because eventually the players do manage to cure Crispin, which was a nice story. So they get to meet some of these guys and become friends with them, and the Hungry Troglodyte becomes a popular place for the players to go back to, mostly because they all love the Demon Wheel. And, it was pretty hilarious when they'd, like, run into the street and they'd, like, beat up some random pedestrian to steal the guy's boots and run back into the inn with a boot or whatever other item they needed, And there were times when they'd go there to try to talk to Vance and get information, and they themselves would be assaulted by random people running out who, in one case, knocked over the barbarian and then began trying to steal his boots, screaming, "I need your boots, man! I need your boots!" And, they instantly realized what was going on, and everybody just kind of laughed, and they're like, "Oh, this is awesome." So the Demon Wheel helped to bring a lot of livelihood to the Hungry Troglodyte, and things it just became a fun place. Plus, Troy's Crispin impersonation was spot on, and that was a source of great hilarity. So anyway, moving things along, I'm going to try to pick up the speed here a bit. The players next are hired. Muncie puts in a good word for them. There ends up being this like outbreak of this disease in the docks area, and this was a storyline that I took from a Pathfinder campaign. And I've never played Pathfinder, but at one point I just Googled like all these like people's recommendations for the best Pathfinder paths or whatever they call them there, adventure paths I think they're called, and I read through a bunch of them and just kind of like looked at different ones. But one that really stuck out to me was this one fairly low-level mission, which was about this magical disease that breaks out in the city. And I was like, man, that'll be perfect to have in my siege. So I didn't want to like penalize like paladins and clerics and other people who can cure disease or who are immune to disease. So their immunities still worked. They could still cure people, whatever, right? But the idea is that there's this huge outbreak at the docks, and now most of the paladins and clerics in the city are actually trying to like stem the tides of this, right? Because you still only have so many cure spells a day, and you can only lay hands so many times. And most of the NPCs, like I said, are very low level. So if you can only cure 1 or 2 people a day, but 1,000 people getting infected a day, then it's going to take like everybody who can basically working on this to try to stem the tide. And in the adventure, the disease was actually created magically, and they used a bunch of coins, which I thought was very clever, because of course the coins are changing hands all the time. People are buying and spending and selling and whatnot, and so the coins are just spreading this disease, and the entire docks district is like they had to seal it down and shut it down because like it's just a huge, massive outbreak. And the docks are one of the biggest districts in Whitespire. It's this huge section of Lowtown. I should probably mention as well. So there's like the capital district, which everybody just calls Hightown. That's where like a lot of the nobles live. There's the Lowtown, of course, which is the biggest. That's where most of the peasants are. And Lowtown itself has like the slums. It has the docks, and then you have the arts district, which is where a lot of like aspiring poets and painters and whatnot all generally live. And it's kind of nicer, but it's still like, 1-bedroom studio apartment type stuff a lot of cases, right? You have Booktown. Booktown is just this legal quagmire, and literally they're like all these just like giant spires and towers. Half of them seem to be leaning in different directions. And because all these like scribes and notaries and lawyers and everything else, we get tired of having to run down all these stairs and run across the street to another building, go up 8 flights of stairs. They eventually just started building like all these pathways and like running ways across. So you'd literally like run out the window of one building, run down this like terrible wooden bridge with a couple of rope handles to hold on to, and just run through into the window of another building. Like you wouldn't have to go all the way up and down the stairs everywhere. And I stole the idea of Booktown from the Blight, by the way. I just thought it was really funny. Then you had the festival grounds, which is kind of like on this island in the middle. There's like this river that runs through the city. And the north half is like, you know, all the fancy, classy areas. The south side is the slummy ghetto areas. And there's also this area called the Sinks. The Sinks used to be this really nice area. It's technically called the Hollow Hills because the dwarves kept digging in there. But they dug a little too much, and due to the fact that Whitespire is also pretty close to the ocean, part of it just collapsed and flooded with water. So the Sinks are kind of like Venice in a way, where there's like all these like boats and they like paddle or pull their way through all these canals. And you can walk because in some places the water is like, there's no water at all, or it's only like knee deep. But you could hit a sinkhole and sink suddenly like 30 or 50 feet. There's like entire houses in like sinkholes sometimes. And you like go down and you can find like some freaking mansion that's now all destroyed and ruined, right? The Hollow Hills is still quite nice, you know, but there's not really a lot of digging and excavation happening there anymore, needless to say. Anyway, so going back to the disease thing, the players are hired to try to find the source of disease. The clerics and paladins have managed to determine the disease is not naturally caused, and the idea that this disease just happened to break out through magical means in the middle of a siege seems like a pretty big coincidence. So some of them are pretty suspicious, and they're like, hey, we're taxed to the limit here. We cannot afford anyone. But, you know, Muncie put in a good word for you guys. Apparently you can get things done. We'd really, really like it if you could try to do this. So the players end up following the clues, and we pretty much just run that scenario as exactly as written. And the players eventually find the spies and traitors from the Empire of Tarsus and manage to put an end to it. They also find like a cure kind of thing and manage to neutralize everything. And then just given time, the clerics and priests and paladins and whatnot are able to like cure the rest of the people, and they manage to bring things under control. But I really liked that mission. I thought it was pretty good. As far as like other ones, they also end up doing this like haunted house mission, and this was another Pathfinder one I took. It was from Richard Pett, though, who wrote The Blight. And because The Blight was a big source of inspiration for the creation of Whitespire, I just decided to check into a bunch of his other stuff and found that he'd done some Pathfinder stuff. And one of them was like a low-level haunted house mission, which I thought was freaking awesome. So this ended up being just a great like dungeon crawl type thing. And there's a lot of like really spooky things, like there were different events that would trigger. And some of them would just be like some ghost that comes screaming and running at the party, and they just like pass through one of the player characters and disappear. It wasn't all combat stuff, but it was like really like evocative of like the mood and atmosphere that I wanted to set, and it ended up being just a great mission. So they ended up dealing with the haunted house. Eventually, things kind of like lead to they get contacted by Muncie again, and they meet him at like this lighthouse in like this one remote part, like right by the city wall, essentially, of the dock district, or kind of like just north of the dock district, technically. So, anyways, they meet him there, and Muncie has a bunch of the city watch with him, and apparently wants to hire them to do something else, but instead he ends up betraying them and attacking the party. And a couple of city watchmen who've worked with the party already. One of the party members managed to make a really good persuasion check, and they decide just not to fight at all. Like they're just like, what the heck? Why are we attacking these guys? These guys have been helping us. But the players managed to kill Muncie, and when Muncie collapses on the ground, suddenly his body begins to change, and he turns into a doppelganger. So the party members decide to search the local area. They decide to search the lighthouse, and sure enough, inside the lighthouse, they find the dead body of the actual Officer Muncie, as well as several other city watchmen. But among other things, I forgot to mention, there was like this one big party the players got invited to as well. I wanted them to meet some of the nobles, but they didn't really seem to care for the nobles much. They didn't really interact with them much. The bard, though, did manage to do bard things and seduced one member of one of the ladies in waiting that like is friends with the princess. So he ends up, hooking up with her, and finds out some different information and stuff. But at this party, they also managed to meet Elena Eastwich, the woman who's in town for her wedding, right? And who's now going to be living in Whitespire. So they've already met her. They've met her fiance. They've met some of the other players in the noble sector. And because of this, they also realize that one of the bodies in the lighthouse is Elena Eastwich, and one of them is her fiance. So now the players start getting kind of concerned because one of the city guard is like, oh, actually, I saw Elaine, the Lady Elaine, just like no more than an hour ago with the princess. So the players are like, oh crap. So they go to, I missed a whole section. It was actually important. One thing I need to mention is that like the besieging army can't really like get into the city through military conquest. Even though they outnumber the defenders because of the walls, because of everything else, they outnumber them like 2-1 or 3-1, but that's really not enough to beat them in a straight up fight, right? Which is one reason they've used the disease. They've tried to sow all this division and whatnot with all the like justices and blackmailing and bribing different justices to pass these new taxes and stuff, right? And a lot of this stuff is really them just trying to weaken and undermine the city. Their last most desperate ploy was to try to like actually tunnel underneath, and so there's this one moat house in the sinks, and it's a pretty dangerous place to try to tunnel into because literally the tunnels could flood, and so this was kind of their last resort. But everything else has failed, so they tried this. But the player characters end up managing to go into the sinks and put an end to this as well. We ended up having this epic fight where they try to I basically took the moat house dungeon from the village of Hamlet and changed a lot of the monsters because there's like a lot of monsters in there which made no sense to me, but I like the dungeon layout, so I decided to use it, right? And then I just replaced everything. They also find out the one dwarven prince has been kidnapped, so they managed to rescue him because he's being held in the moat house, and they managed to have their big fight. The tunnel's broken out, and some of the invaders start trying to come in, but the players managed to like fight them back. The reason I say the fight was so epic though is because like literally everybody almost died like 3 times over. At one point the necromancer's down to like 2 or 3 hit points, but he managed to use some of his damaging spells that deal necrotic damage and heal himself through his like whatever the one necromancer ability is, like grim whatever, right? And when you kill somebody, you gain hit points back, right? So he manages to work his way back up to like 8 or 9 hit points, then immediately gets shot by like a pair of archers and goes back down to like 1 hit point. And then he manages to work his way back to like 5 or 6, and then gets hit again and takes like 2 or 3 more damage and goes back to like 2 again, right? The paladin at one point, she's down to like 3 hit points. She lay hands herself, and then immediately gets like crit, and then crit again, almost back to back, goes down to 1 hit point. But manages to finish the fight upright with 1 hit point. One of the other characters actually goes down and he's having to fake death saving throws, and literally there's like no healing spells left to take care of this guy. They're just like, well, please make your death saving throws because we got nothing left, you know. We're just trying to save the people that are still upright and on their feet. But in the end, the players managed to persevere. They win the fight, kill the invaders. They managed to like seal the bore underneath where the invaders are trying to come through, and like basically lock everything down and flood the tunnel at one point even. And so they managed to like deal with that issue. But anyway, so now back to the Elena Eastwich story. Sorry, I got things out of order there. But anyways, we're too deep in to re-record everything now, so you know it's you're just gonna have to live with it. Anyways, they get betrayed by the Muncie, but it turns out he's a doppelganger. They find out about the dead Elaine and her fiance. They go to try to save the princess, and they manage to make some just great persuasion rolls and convince some of the guards that what they're doing is accurate. And they've managed to like pick up a couple of the nobles that they've recognized along the way as well. So that lends them some clout as well. So I decided to give them advantage on a couple of their checks, right? And they managed to get into the king's throne room, and then they find the princess choking to death the princess, and the king with a sword covered in blood standing over the dead body of the king. So of course the fight ensues. The players manage to save the actual princess and prevent her from being choked to death. They capture the one doppelganger and kill the other doppelganger. And at this point, basically everything the enemy army's been trying to do is kind of starting to fall apart. The players also managed to expose the plot to like pass these taxes and stuff. They find out the one guy was actually being blackmailed. Well, they thought he was being blackmailed. And that was Bracken, Chief Constable or Chief Crown Justice Bracken, who is the leader of the Temple of Dawnblast, right? And he'd managed to convince the Master of Taxes, who's one of the other Crown Justices, that hey, we should pass these new taxes and we'll get lots of money, right? And that guy's like, oh hey, great idea, you know? And he's basically been seduced by Bellatrix, the Widow of Lust, this demon queen who I've had in my story since level 1, and Shadaza, the paladin who was at the Temple of Dawnblast, has actually met her a couple of times because she just thinks that Bellatrix is this 17-year-old acolyte named Leandra. The players later discover, though, that Leandra and the High Priest are having an affair, and so they force him to resign in disgrace, and he's forced to leave his position. They manage to end the taxes and the siege, save the city. They haven't, however, bothered to look into Leandra's true nature. As far as they know, she's just some pretty acolyte that was having an affair with the High Priest. But, you know, he's been stripped of his position, removed in disgrace, and forced to step down. And so this kind of culminates the first, 5 levels. The city rejoices, they have a big banquet, and the nobles manage to work out a deal where the princess does indeed become the new queen, but she appoints a bunch of her older half-brothers and sisters to various positions of authority in the empire. The Master of Taxes, of course, is forced to resign as well. So the High Priestess, who takes over the Temple of Dawnblast, I think her name was Anaya, she ends up getting promoted and she becomes the new Justice of Law. But one of her brothers and sisters is appointed to the new Justice of Taxes. And one of the other justices, he ends up retiring as well because, you know, just kind of the whole sordid affair. And that leaves an empty spot for one of the other NPCs who is actually evil, but the player characters didn't know this. And she moves into that position. She was actually the head of this coven, and the players never investigated her at all. They just thought she was cool because she was a member of the Inverted Pyramid. So, you know, how could she be bad, right? You know, how could an evil warlock from the same mage guild as me possibly be bad? Anyways, the players are also given a fairly tidy sum of money each. I think I gave them each 5,000 gold, which on a level 5 character is ridiculous. But I also wanted it to be, you know, a fairly big reward, you know? And so at this point, the new queen actually stays you know, the city coffers are basically bankrupt at this point. But, you know, it was the least she could do in gratitude for the players saving her life, getting her to the throne, ending the siege, etc., etc. And so the players mostly decided to just buy themselves better living accommodations. At this point, all the player characters have moved into the city. Crag and Silas buy themselves a nice house in the Hollow Hills. Magnus buys himself a nice place. Shadaza gets herself, she decides the Temple of Dawnblast just isn't really working for her at this point. So she moves to the Temple of a Nun and becomes the Oath of the Ancients paladin. And Nun is kind of one of the nature gods in my campaign. So it was a nice fit. And, you know, most of the players just bought themselves better places or whatever, right? Alatar was staying at a brothel. He'd actually, when his first night in town, he meets this cabbie. And he's just this gnome, so Alatar likes him immediately because he loves gnomes. And this guy's just got this, just this ancient-looking horse that looks like it's 2 steps away from death. But he runs this, coach service and he takes people around. So Alatar asks him where's a nice place to go, and this guy refers him to this one brothel. Alatar assumes this is some sort of inn, and so he just goes there. And then he ends up just eventually buying the place, and he still doesn't know it's a brothel because he's so innocent and naive. He just thinks that there's all these lovely girls that are all staying at the inn. It's a little unfortunate. They seem to have a lot of male friends, a few too many for his liking. A few of the girls are maybe not dressing as appropriate as they probably should. They should really respect themselves a little more. But they're all very nice, lovely women. And Alatar, of course, because he's a charming sorcerer with a huge charisma, all the girls love Alatar, but Alatar never does anything with any of them. And so they basically just assume he must be gay and, you know, whatever. He's just not into women, I guess, right? But he buys the place, and they're all quite happy with that arrangement, too. And Alatar just now owns the brothel. Well, a brothel. And it's a licensed brothel as well. There's like an actual guild in the city, and they just run all the brothels and stuff, right? And they all pay taxes to the king, and well, now the queen, so there's like actual licensed places. There's also places that are not licensed, and those are more in the, poor areas. But, a lot of these places, they cater to like the nobles or whatever, and they all pay taxes, right? So, it's just a source of income for the city. And of course, they have a guild to represent all their houses, right? So anyways, that basically concluded like Act 1. It took the players from levels 1 to 5, like I said. And like I said, it starts with a bunch of the players being new to town or wherever, just living wherever, and ends with them all getting a nice tidy sum of money, reaching level 5, and actually establishing themselves in the community, and now actually being recognized as the heroes of the city. And they're each given like different like emblems by the princess and basically I just made it so that they would all have advantage on persuasion checks for anybody from Whitespire who is in a position to recognize, right? So if you're talking to commoners, they might not be that impressed, but any of the people who'd actually met them, any of the guild houses and stuff, this was a really nice boon for all the party members, right? So, they've already established themselves as people of importance and pillars of the community, right? And then from here, I knew that I was going to kind of open things up more, and I wanted to get the players out of Whitespire, because literally at this point, they haven't left the city at all from levels 1 to 5, right? Everything they've done has been inside the city, because they've been under siege this entire time, or trapped in an inn during a massive storm at level 1, right? But they haven't had a chance to leave, and, I thought that'd be kind of fun to start taking them to other areas. So, in the next video, we'll cover the second pillar of play, which was mostly them exploring and going to areas in the vicinity of Whitespire. I should also mention that some of the like noble elements and stuff, with like the doppelgangers and stuff like that, was from a different campaign, also from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And it's like one of the most iconic, legendary campaigns that game ever produced, called The Enemy Within. And one particular part has this one noble called the Graph, and they try to like murder him and replace him with a doppelganger. And I really liked that idea. So I had multiple doppelgangers, of course, and I changed a bunch of the events to sort of fit what I wanted my story to be. But I really liked that idea, and it is a real classic. If you ever play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, definitely check out the Enemy Within campaign. Now, since then, because it's been so well received and because it's this legendary classic, they've added like, part 2.5 and part 3.5 and a bunch of other ones that really are just not even really connected to the main story, that are like super tangents and stuff, just to try to like milk it for all it's worth. But the actual main storyline is phenomenal. I cannot recommend it highly enough. So I did want to give credit where credit's due, in case anybody's familiar with it and you're like, hey, some of it sounded kind of familiar and you didn't say anything about it, but you mentioned these other ones. Like I said, I steal stuff from other people all the time. And my general theme is, I have an idea of what I want my story to be and kind of where I want things to go, but I also want things to be very open-ended, so the players aren't being railroaded, and so their decisions actually matter. And so a lot of times I'll just make like notes, right? Like I'll have, like my giant binder of campaign stuff, and it might just be like, this forest has a bunch of orcs, and then there's a cave in it, and that cave is going to be such and such a dungeon complex that I took from some adventure or whatever, right? Now I don't have to design a giant dungeon or mini dungeon or anything else. I can just like, oh, the player's going there? Okay, what is this? Oh, okay, that's that thing. Okay, I know what that is. And then I can just, run that thing, right? So it works out well for me. Saves me a lot of time for having to design a lot of dungeons. Like I mentioned with the moat house from the village of Hamlet, I will often just like replace everything in the dungeon, but keep the maps, keep the room descriptions, and then just change the monsters to be, whatever I think is going to be appropriate, even like level appropriate. Like you can take a level 1 or 2 dungeon and run a bunch of like level 18 characters through it if you just have them fight appropriate challenge rating stuff, right? And if you think, hey, this dungeon has some cool ideas and some cool traps, and maybe there's some puzzles and riddles that I kind of like, or whatever other mechanic might have attracted you to it, you can just basically reskin anything and just make it whatever you need, right? So like I said, I do that kind of stuff all the time. I will steal different adventures or snippets of different adventures, or I might just take 1 or 2 levels of a dungeon. Maybe I find some giant mega dungeon, right? Dungeon of the Mad Mage would be a prime example. I haven't actually used Dungeon of the Mad Mage, but just a giant dungeon with a bunch of levels. But maybe you're like, hey, I want to run my players through a dungeon, but I don't want to do Dungeon of the Mad Mage because it's going to take forever, and I don't want the entire campaign to be this one dungeon. Then don't just steal a couple of the levels you really like and just have that be the dungeon. And yeah, you'll probably have to change a few things here and there, but it's actually like way easier to do that than it is to constantly be designing new stuff, especially if your players never go there, right? It can be a lot of work. Whereas, like I said, I like to just have a few brief notes and be like, okay, this is this and this is that, and follow my general rule of, if I invent a place, have some sort of secret or something connected to that place. If I invent an NPC, have something connected to that NPC. Even if it's not a secret, even if it's nothing bad, just something that makes that person stand out. The players met this like dwarven town crier in my game as well, right? And half the party loved the guy, half the party hated the guy. That's usually a sign that you've made a really weird and interesting NPC. And he was just a fun character, right? And guys like Vance and Johan were people that the players came back to over and over again, and would do the Demon Wheel game with, and things like that, right? And so a lot of these NPCs, they didn't need to be like super deep, but they just needed to have 1 or 2 things that kind of like stood out in the player's mind, right? And in my next campaign, which the players in that campaign were completely different player characters, but they were in the same game world. And they didn't even know it at first because they were actually on a different continent, so they never even heard of Whitespire. But as they got to higher and higher level, eventually they ended up going to Whitespire, and they get sent by some NPC to the Hungry Troglodyte. And sure enough, they end up like meeting there's a bunch of dwarves in there that the players never interacted with, but the players wanted to actually go up north. There's like all these dwarves up in the northern mountains, so they end up meeting with the dwarves, and they end up seeing Vance and Johan. They don't recognize them, but the players, of course, all do, right? And they're like, oh, we're at the Hungry Troglodyte, and there's a bunch of people playing the demon wheel and spinning the wheel, and the players like absolutely loved it. It was something I thought would be kind of fun and cool, but the players like just thought it was like the greatest thing ever. And now they're getting to meet other, like they've always seen the dwarves, but the dwarves are always by themselves singing and drinking and stuff like that. But now they're actually meeting these other patrons who their other characters had seen numerous times but never interacted with, right? And it was just kind of fun to have some of these kind of callbacks again, right? And a lot of the fun was from the fact that, oh yeah, when the players first came to town as well, they end up meeting the freaking gnome with a giant top hat and his horse that, 8 years later looks even closer to death than it did 8 years ago, but miraculously the thing is still alive, right? But they instantly recognized that guy as well, and it was just really, really fun that, from 2 different campaigns when things started to overlap and intertwine, the players were like, oh, I remember that guy, oh, I remember this guy, oh, hey, I remember that guy, and it was really nice for me to just have these like NPCs that had really just been like throwaway NPCs in some ways, but because I gave them a little bit of personality, because I'd written down a name somewhere, later on when I decided, hey, I should have them go to Whitespire, all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, I still have all these notes on all these NPCs. And I was able to go back there, and just from this one simple page of notes, it brought everybody so much joy, including me. So anyways, that's everything. I'm starting to ramble a bunch. We essentially finished the video 10 minutes ago at this stage. But whatever. Thank you for watching. If you actually made it to the end, of course, feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and most importantly, leave me your comments in the comment section. I look forward to reading them all. I know this video series isn't going to be among my most popular, but that's perfectly fine. I'm actually having a really good time just talking about the campaigns and crazy stuff that happened in them, and reliving some of those memories. And I really loved all the player characters in this campaign as well. I mentioned in the last video that like Crag was probably my favorite, but the truth is like Alatar was a ton of fun. Magnus was awesome. Like I loved all of them. Like Shadaza and Cole were great characters. I loved all 5 of the player characters. I thought they were some of the best and funnest characters that my players have ever made, really. Especially Crag, of course. Crag, you're the winner. You stood out the most. And part of why you won is because you were so terrible at everything, and it just brought me so much joy to see you roll so many 1s and 2s every time you ever attempted to do something. It was just an absolute delight, and everybody else loved it too. You know, Crag excelled at one thing, and that was smashing people in the face with his great axe. And at everything else, as great as he was at smashing people in the face, he was equally poor at everything else. But he kept trying, and that's what made him so delightful. But anyways, that's everything. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.